Longtime Spokane Talk radio personality and award-winning broadcast veteran, Mike Fitzsimmons.
Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year to you. We're starting a brand new season, and there's so much to talk about. I would hope in any event that you had a good holiday season. We had an event that occurred yesterday. It hasn't occurred in literally since the early part of the history of our nation. We had a breach of the Capitol building yesterday, and there's much being said about it, but there isn't a whole lot that the folks who are yapping know about this situation. First of all, let us remember to define what we're here for. We're here to apply critical thinking to issues of our time. And what is critical thinking? It is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. Keyword, the objective analysis, not your political opinion, not your ideology, but an objective analysis. Look at the facts. What do they tell us? What do they not tell us? What can we not derive from them? Then we evaluate the issue in order to form a judgment. But as you know, politicians and the press form judgments even before they know anything about anything. And that's part of the problem we're dealing with on this day after that particular incident. The press has made it clear to us that Trump incited the violent assault on Capitol Hill yesterday in a desperate last-ditch bid to hold on to the White House. That's what they're telling. That's their line. The president caused an insurrection. Now, you can understand how the political opponents of Donald Trump might want people to believe that. You can even understand why the press might be partial to that particular point of view, but it isn't true. It isn't true. There are calls to impeach Trump before he leaves office, even on January the 20th. Not because he committed any kind of a crime, but because it would be a great opportunity with the Senate and the House both in the hands of the Democrats in the next couple of weeks to impeach him and convict him, because if he's convicted, he can never run for a political office again. And that tells you how frightened the left is of Donald Trump and a possible comeback in 2024. The press hates Trump. You understand that. There are calls to impeach him, disqualify him from ever running for office, and they have vilified his tweets and the video statement he made yesterday, said it was the wrong message or that it was not strong enough. Now, you can appreciate the fact that for the last 3-4 years, as he has been president of the United States, there's nothing he has ever been able to say that would satisfy the left and the media. And anything he said yesterday wouldn't have done it anyway. And you know it, and so do I. If you're going to be objective about it, you know it, and so do I. And I don't care what your politics is. And by the way, I am not here to convince you of anything. I am here to challenge you to think about these issues objectively, to analyze them and come to some judgment about them. It's predicated on the facts and predicated upon an intellectual exercise, not your gut, not your emotions. Let us recognize that our understanding of what happened on Capitol Hill yesterday is completely based on the media's narrative. And indeed, that narrative has so often been driven by a strong anti-Trump bias and left-wing agenda that reprehensible disregard for the truth has been sort of standard fare on the part of the mainstream media. The events of yesterday, January 6th, they haven't been investigated in sufficient detail at all as of this hour to come to the conclusions that the left and the media have been spewing virtually since yesterday afternoon when it all happened to begin with. Now, we do know some things. What do we know about this? We know that there were upwards of 200,000 peaceful demonstrators in Washington, D.C., in and around the Capitol complex yesterday. We know there was a rally. We know that Trump spoke to that rally. We also know that those demonstrators were peaceful. By and large, they were there, as they have been to rallies for many, many months now, to support Trump, whether you agree with their support or don't agree with their support, but they weren't there to cause any harm or any damage. Police say that perhaps 150 to as many as 300, and they're not sure about this yet, so-called rioters managed to get inside the Capitol Rotunda, and only a couple of dozen of them managed to get inside the House and Senate chambers yesterday and the offices of various congressional leaders. We also know this. They have interviewed a whole lot of folks who were on the Capitol grounds yesterday, a lot of folks. And they have discovered, the authorities have, that this was highly unexpected by Trump supporters who did not show up to do damage and did no damage themselves. Today, law enforcement agencies, in fact, released some information that they used facial recognition technology software that identified many well-known Antifa operatives among those who breached the House and the Senate chambers. If you have ever been to a Trump rally, or if you've ever watched one on television, you'll know that these people are not violent. The Trump supporters do not support violence. Indeed, they are law and order folks. Many of the so-called protesters who broke into the Capitol were equipped with helmets and ropes and knee pads and backpacks that contained riot gear, including chemical sprays and assorted weapons. That's not your typical Trump supporter. But they're all being lumped together, a couple of 100,000 people and a handful of others, and they're all supposedly guilty of the same thing. That's the judgment of the press, but that isn't a critical thinker's understanding of the process. Now, while police say that some of those removed from the Capitol, in fact, were Trump supporters, and they were. In fact, the woman who was shot and killed was a Trump supporter. The wrong place at the wrong time, clearly. But they noted that they had never encountered Trump rally attendees or conservative demonstrators who came equipped for participation in riots. But just a handful of them did. Could they possibly have been outsiders who infiltrated the process? Possibly. Could they have been folks who were strong Trump supporters who just went sour and did the wrong thing? Possibly. But we don't know the answer to that question. We really don't. If you're going to be fair, you got to be fair. There is no justification. Let me underscore that. No justification whatsoever for that assault on the nation's capital yesterday. None. We cannot, we must not ever condone violence of that nature. Ever. No matter what the cause. And I stand with you on that. But fair-minded people are going to have to agree that those who came to protest peacefully arguably had a legitimate cause to be protesting that day, even if the media and the Democrats disagree, and you know that they do. They disagree. They don't believe that there was any legitimate cause whatsoever. Since November the 3rd, the media narrative on presidential election of 2020 has been that there was absolutely no evidence of election fraud, no evidence of voter fraud to speak of. None. It was a clean election. It was a fair election. Every legal vote was counted. No illegal votes were counted. But we also know that there is legitimate reason to believe that that narrative simply isn't true. That's their story, though, and they're sticking with it. You can expect that. Nearly 75 million Americans voted for Donald Trump on November 3rd. Nearly 75 million people. Now, these are not wayward-minded individuals who are just crazies and don't know what it is they want in life and all the rest. Many of these are mature, intelligent, thoughtful individuals who chose a president who didn't win that election. 70% of Republicans, 39% of independents, and even 17% of Democrats, according to several polls, a composite of several polls, believe that this election was rigged. They believe that the election was not fair and was not free. Now, whether it was or whether it wasn't, we don't know. These folks have those beliefs. And when you have almost 50% of the vote-casting public believing that their vote didn't count and that somebody cheated and stole the election, That is not a good place for a country's electorate to be. Simply isn't. That cannot be a prevailing feeling if we're going to move forward and believe that our elections actually are valid and meaningful to the American public. We've got to do something better than we did in this one. So why do these people, why do they believe this? Well, several thousand, not just a handful, several thousand credible whistleblowers have come forward in many states in the last 6 weeks since the election. And they have submitted affidavits under oath, under penalty of perjury, and that these affidavits offer compelling evidence of fraud. Things like stuff in the ballot boxes, tabulation machines that changed votes that came in for Trump, but they awarded them to Biden. Dead people voting, thousands of them. We're not talking about a handful here. In many, many states. Incarcerated felons voting, thousands of them, not just a few. Intimidation of vote counting observers by election officials, especially if those observers were GOP observers in several of these special states, the battleground states. Ballot harvesting, tampering with ballots, non-citizens who voted. Talking about folks who are in this country and are not citizens of the United States casting a ballot. Lots of them, not just a few. Non-residents voting as well. People who didn't live in the state or in the county where their vote was cast. People who hadn't lived there in some cases for 15, 20 years, and yet they voted in that county. And then when they were contacted by name at their present address, they said, I didn't cast a vote there. And then, of course, there were, in many cases, in many precincts, more votes cast in the election than there were actually registered voters. And in some cases, more votes cast than there was actual population in that district. Now, when all that is added together, you could say, well, that didn't change anything. It's, we always have mistakes and everything. Yeah, okay, I'll buy all of that. I'll buy all of it. We always have mistakes. However, these people who observed the things they observed were not fools. They were not folks who didn't understand what they were seeing. We're talking about people who are professionals in IT, for example, folks who are statistical analysts for Fortune 500 companies who served on the election committees in various states and understood the business of statistics and data and realized, wait a minute, something's not right here. Something's just not right here. And then they looked into it and discovered what wasn't right, said, I got to talk to somebody about that. These are the kinds of things that were happening. And then we had the constitutional issue, a central issue in this whole process, involving Article 1, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, to wit, only state legislatures, elected lawmakers in the House and the Senate at the state level are authorized under the Constitution to set the rules for federal elections. Nobody else. Not judges, not governors, not secretaries of state. And in a number of these states, those rules were violated by people who thought they knew better than the legislature, but never referred to the legislature or gave the legislature an opportunity to change the procedures in the election. You had governors who thought, well, we've got COVID, we've got all these problems, we're going to have to fix this situation. We don't want to expose these people to the possibility of illness, so we're going to allow them to mail in their ballots. We'll just mail them a ballot and they can mail it back in. And so what did they do? They blanket mailed ballots to every household in that particular district, in that state, millions of them, with the understanding that a vast number of those would go to places where the intended recipient didn't even live, but where it would be possible to harvest those ballots, fill them out, and vote those ballots anyway, even if it wasn't the individual to whom that ballot was supposed to belong. You had people who showed up at the polls on the 3rd of November and wanted to cast a ballot and were told you can't do it. Well, why not? Because you already voted. I did not. Yes, you were sent a ballot and you sent it back in. I was not. And so would they give them a provisional ballot, which essentially means now you have two ballots. We're going to have to figure out which one is which. But we didn't do that. We validated the election in some of these communities without ever having done that. Now, this is what actually happened, folks. This is why people are upset. This is why people can't trust the system. This is part of the reason why. The Constitution says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. That's stated in the Constitution. Now, I know that many folks in America, many folks who cast ballots, many folks who legitimately attempted to do the right thing with respect to this election and all elections, don't know very much about the Constitution at all. And since they don't, they have no idea about this sort of thing. And so when they hear about that, after their governor or their secretary of state or whoever told them, oh yeah, you can do it other than the way in which the legislature put this whole thing together, they don't have any reason to doubt that because they don't know that that's not right. But courts do. Courts know this. State and federal courts rejected almost every legal challenge to the election, almost exclusively on procedural grounds, such as standing to sue. And many times they were not just wrong, they were deliberately wrong. They were being political. Not a single court, however, and this is something you should know, and this is something that causes people who mistrust the electoral process now to be where they are in terms of that trust, because not a single court ever examined any evidence. They never tried a single legal challenge on the merits. And of course, the press is telling everybody, well, there weren't any merits. The press was telling everybody, as were the Democrats, there is not a single piece of evidence that anything afoul took place, which is BS on its face. They know it, but they'll tell you what's untrue as long as it advances the token. And obviously, the judiciary didn't want to get involved. Not even the Supreme Court, which, by the way, identified a cause of action in a very similar situation back in the year 2000, in the Bush versus Gore case, that set a precedent under which the court could have taken on the Article 1, Section 4 issue in the 2020 election, but refused to do it and refused on a flimsy, procedural, artful dodge. In other words, they didn't want to get involved in what was a political issue, although they did get involved virtually on the same central issue in 2000 when the state of Florida tried to change election rules outside the legislature. They claimed that the individuals who were charging foul here, several different states, 17 different states attorney generals, didn't have standing to sue on the theory that their citizens weren't harmed by this. Wait a minute. Are citizens in your state injured at all by illegality in elections, national elections, in another state? Of course they are. You could wind up with somebody that really wasn't elected. That's pretty serious. And the Supreme Court knew it. But they dodged it. And that was wrong. And history will prove that that was a regrettable mistake on the part of the United States Supreme Court. When Trump campaign lawyers appeared before the state legislative oversight committees in the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Wisconsin, Georgia, and I think Nevada as well, in the weeks following the general election, their witnesses and their forensic and concrete empirical provable evidence was plentiful, and it was also compelling. If you had spent any time watching that, Those hearings were on cable television stations, some cable television stations, I should say, not all. Those hearings were quite something. I happened to spend a number of hours watching that testimony, looking at the charts and the graphs and the documents and the evidence that were being presented. And as someone trained in the law, I looked at that and said, you know what? This is compelling evidence. This is part of the merit of the claim that this was not a fair and free election, and this needs to be aired in a court. But it wasn't. And the worst part, the press ignored these proceedings. They didn't report to you about this. You didn't hear about these proceedings much in the newspapers. You didn't see them on network newscasts. You didn't see them on local newscasts. They didn't cover it. Selective coverage of things that benefit the press's interests is a well-known fact. Trust me, I've been in the media business for doggone near 50 years. And I have seen it all. I know what they do. I know how the procedures unfold. I know the game that gets played. They ignore things and the public doesn't know about them. Therefore, the public doesn't believe they even happen. And when somebody raises the question and the public's never seen any evidence of this in other reports around, they come to the conclusion that, well, whatever you're charging's got to be false. It can't possibly be true. And that's how you perpetuate the concept that this is all a bunch of conspiracy theories. There's no real evidence to the process. The mainstream media didn't cover these sessions and continued to label the legal case for election fraud as baseless. And the word baseless, ask yourself, reading newspapers or watching broadcasts, how many times have you heard the anchor say that the evidence the Trump administration or Trump campaign was attempting to put forward was baseless? Where'd that come from? That came from a conspiracy to not cover and to label and to know full well that the local stations that would carry this sort of thing carry it verbatim, and the local papers carry it verbatim, and never put any critical thinking into what they're presenting to their audience as truth at all. That's how the press works. And that, by the way, is not a matter of fundamental dishonesty on their part. It is dishonest. It's a matter of economics. It's actually a matter of economics. The content isn't messed with. You can cut down the size of the article a little bit, but you can't mess with the content. That's in your contract with these wire services. And then when outliers come along and say, hey, I have information about this or I have information about that, nobody wants to believe them because, hey, it's not reciprocated or supported or replicated in the mainstream press, so therefore it can't possibly be true. You're just making this up. That's where we find ourselves. Now, by the way, if you want to connect with the program and chat with me about this, I want to welcome you to do that. Here's how you do it. Take a look at this little piece of information now on the bottom of your screen. All right. Vinny at Spokane Talksnet, Spokane Net, I can't read that. Vinny at SpokaneTalksMedia.com. Whoa, there you go, mouthful. That's how you do it. Now, when you call that up, you're going to be given a numerical password. And that password, if you have a camera and a microphone on your computer or your phone or whatever, you'll be able to talk to me. So feel free to jump in at any time you'd like to. I would love to hear from you, especially folks who don't see it the same way I do. That would be perfectly all right with me if you gave us that opportunity to chat. Okay, so Vinny at SpokaneTalksMedia.com. You'll get a numerical password, and you'll be matched with me on the screen in real time, and we can chat about this. This program is being brought to you through the generosity of our sponsor, Steve Major. I want to thank Steve for his support of this program. We're going to take a time out here, and when we return, we're going to continue with the role of the media in all of this that we're seeing unfold.
Well, this is Bloomsday in Spokane. We got about 40 firefighters and their friends and family handing out 40,000 cups of water as the day goes by.
It's a very good opportunity to see the public and support them and help them out and cheer them on during Bloomsday.
It's one of the best things about Spokane is that we have these major events and the whole community comes together not just to participate but to volunteer and show that they really care about our city and making our city look great.
This type of an event really is emblematic of Spokane because so many people get involved. We have 50,000 people probably running this race. Always has been a very huge event.
Right now we're at the corner of Broadway and Nettleton. It's the last water station before the finish, so people are pretty much dehydrated by the time they get to us. They really need our water.
The water stations are a vital part, especially on warm days like today. It's real important that we have the volunteers to help with that. Without the volunteers, Bloomsday wouldn't exist.
All up and down the course, there are people that are involved in this celebration. It really is a celebration of what Spokane's all about.
Welcome back to this edition of Four Critical Thinkers. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the press and how we know what we know about whether or not the 2020 election for president was a fair and just election, whether there was any type of fraud or skullduggery associated with it, and what the press's role has been in preserving what we know and protecting themselves and their cronies against what they know but don't want us to know. The national news media, have you noticed this? This is a relatively new phenomenon. How long has it been since you've been listening to news or watching news or reading newspapers, and then all of a sudden, within the last year or two, we have fact checkers. Fact checkers, right? Fact checkers. The news media offers us fact checking. Who does the fact checking? The news media, right? In other words, you got the fox at the door to the chicken house, and you're asking, are there any foxes in there? And they look in and come back to you and say, nah, we don't see any foxes in there. That's just a bad rumor. No foxes in here. Fact checking, most prominently by the Associated Press. They're fact-checking generally things that are being said. If you notice it, if you keep score and watch, they're fact-checking things that are being said by the right side of the aisle, not the left side of the aisle. So if a conservative claims something, that gets fact-checked. If a liberal says something, that does not get fact-checked. Why? Because the liberal and the media happen to be in league together. That's why. Most prominent claims by the Trump campaign following the election were all fact-checked, and claims that were made on social media actually got suspended. You didn't get to hear them. The Associated Press, thus, was the principal fact-checker in many of these matters. The same Associated Press, by the way, and let's not forget this, the same Associated Press that ignored the Hunter Biden pay-to-play scandal to protect his father's bid for the presidency. The same folks who didn't want you to know about that because you might cast some doubt on Hunter Biden, or on Joe Biden, whom they wanted elected president. And so what did they do? They just didn't tell you about that for the most part, but if you learned about it and made a claim on social media or a letter to the editor, they fact-checked. Oh, that's not true. That's not. And then what happened? After the election was over, they all admitted it was true all along. The conduct by the mainstream media in this matter is easily explained. Why they do what they do? They hate Donald Trump. They always have. They have long wanted to get rid of him. That's what this has always been about. For 3 years, one of them, and I'm not talking just about the politicians who kept pushing this, but the newsrooms and the journalists who knew this was bogus. They just kept right on pushing it. In November of 2020, the press could not allow any challenge to the election results that would threaten the defeat of Joe Biden. And so they stepped way over the line. It wasn't just advocacy, it was fundamental dishonesty that was applied to the process in order to protect their guy. Another piece of this media-wide effort to silence challenges to the November election came from social media platforms. Now, many Americans don't read newspapers. Many Americans do not watch network telecasts. In fact, newspapers and network telecasts are hemorrhaging audience to the broader online platforms that exist, the social media platforms. Many Americans don't get their news from the conventional media. Google they rely on, and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. That's where they get their news. Now, they still run the risk of that news, quote unquote, that they're getting being untrue, faulty, or somehow or other misinformed, but they trust it. The power of these social media platforms, therefore, simply cannot be denied. Legally armed with exemption from legal recourse under what is known as Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, these companies, Twitter, Google, Facebook, with hundreds of millions of subscribers worldwide, quietly began about a year and a half or so ago to censor any posts that threatened their interests and their agendas. Donald Trump, since late 2019, has been a vocal advocate of the revocation of Section 230, often found in his tweets. And since he was, suddenly his tweets started to be struck down, to be suspended. His account was attacked. The President of the United States account was attacked by a private company whose interest was to protect their ability to censor what people say on their platforms. And so they were censoring all of their members if the information didn't agree with them, including the president. Facebook started censoring pro-Trump posts they didn't like under the guise of user violations of platform policy for such things as hate speech or misinformation. And who defined all of that? Of course, they did. And the goalposts, if you look at the updates that they kept publishing for Facebook users and for Twitter users, the goalposts kept moving all the time. Started to include things that it didn't include earlier on, and it became so hazy that the bottom line was, because we disagree with it, even though they would never admit that, although they had to, and both the Facebook CEO and the Twitter CEO did admit it in so many words before a congressional hearing this past fall. Audits and investigations and research about tweets and posts that were routinely blocked showed that conservative views and opinions seemed to get the axe, even if valid and provable, and the views and opinions of the left wing, even if they were verifiably false, were left alone. Now, that's not fair. You know that's not fair. That's not fair, that's not reliable. But what do you do about it? You have no recourse. If Section 230 were to be reversed, then these platforms would have to be treated as publishers who could be sued if they violated the First Amendment rights of their users, just like newspapers can be sued if they commit libel, slander, that sort of thing. These folks are exempt. They're scot-free. And because they are, they have assumed the authority to keep you quiet if they don't like what you're saying. How American does that sound? Like the mainstream media, the top social media platforms even started censoring news outlets whose stories they objected to. You remember this? Maybe you don't, because the mainstream media didn't want to cover this. They didn't want to expose this, and it was a very limited number of viewers and readers who actually got this information. In October of 2020, Twitter was suspended, I should say, for 16 days, the account of the New York Post. The New York Post, a newspaper that's been around longer than almost any other newspaper in the North American continent. They suspended the account, objecting to what was true and well-researched exclusive news reports about documents that showed that Hunter Biden's extensive peddling of influence, corruption, and the involvement of his father in that, Joe Biden, who was running for president, was true. Twitter clearly engaged in election interference in that. Understand this. It all goes back to why people are angry and don't trust the electoral process. They engaged in election interference because they falsely claimed that documents were hacked. They knew that they were not. And that was the justification to suspend the New York Post, the information of which that they were placing in their newspaper articles obviously was a serious threat, a severe threat to Joe Biden's ability to get elected. And indeed, by the way, the double standard applied. Had that been Donald Trump's son, Don Jr., that would have been front page news, you could be sure, notwithstanding the fact that the election was just a few weeks away. Election interference. De facto election interference. A lot of folks who went to the polls on November the 3rd and learned after the fact that Hunter Biden had in fact been peddling influence for a number of years, and that his uncle, the brother of Joe Biden, had been peddling influence for a number of years. We're talking decades. And that Joe Biden was receiving financial remuneration from this process. They proved that. These articles proved that. They were documented. They had witnesses. They had all kinds of hard evidence with respect to this. But they wouldn't report it. They didn't report it. And the folks who did report it and the folks who wanted to discuss it on Facebook and on Twitter were not permitted to bring the subject up. It's a lot of power those folks have. The Post was able to prove unequivocally that there was no evidence whatsoever that the documents that they were presenting in their articles were not authentic, and the arbitrary blocking of the Post was a significant moment during a critical time in the election season of 2020. I would be willing to bet that some of you are hearing that for the very first time right now. In fact, I would be willing to bet that some of you are hearing many of the things I'm telling you for the very first time. Because the media outlets you subscribe to, the social media platforms you subscribe to won't tell you these things. The idea of objectivity in the press, the idea that we report and you make up your own mind about what that means, that's what journalism's supposed to do. That is not what journalism does anymore. If you think that it does, your naivete is showing. There are countless other facts that I could present to you that contribute to a sense that the American presidential electoral system was rigged this time around, and may have been rigged on numerous occasions in the past that we just didn't know about. There was no evidence that surfaced about it. But consider also this. Consider the underlying left-wing influenced environment in which American conservatives find themselves, in which Trump supporters find themselves. Here are observations that I just learned about today, and I think they're very, very interesting. Taken from a recent piece that is attributed to the American radio host Dave Ramsey. And I think it says it best. This is an excerpt from what he wrote. I have been confused, he says, by the hostility of family and friends. I look at people I have known all of my life, so hate-filled that they agree with opinions they would never express as their own. I think that might well have entered, that I might well have entered the twilight zone, Dave writes. You can't justify this insanity. We have become a nation that has lost its collective mind. We see other countries going socialist and collapsing, but it seems like a great plan to us. Somehow it's un-American for the census count to count how many Americans there are in America. People who say that there is no such thing as gender are demanding a female president. Universities that advocate equality and discriminate against Asian Americans in favor of African Americans. And then there are some people who are held responsible for things that happened before they were born, and other folks who aren't held responsible for things they do right now. There's a little more to this, and I'll share it with you after we take this time out.
When you donate your vehicle to the Union Gospel Mission, you're not just giving a car. You taught your kids to drive in this car. You sent your first kid off to college. You brought your baby home. This car isn't just transportation. It's a piece of your history. Keep the good memories going. When you donate, you're providing food, shelter, and the opportunity for a whole new life. When you donate to the Union Gospel Mission thrift stores, your items help change lives. The furniture your kids jumped on and fell off of. The clothes you really should get rid of, but still look fantastic in. That old lamp you've clung to for so long. Every donation stays 100% local and helps provide food, a safe and healing environment, and job training. Union Gospel Mission thrift stores. Donate your items and help real people find real change.
The radio talk show host Dave Ramsey continues to write, criminals are caught and released to hurt more people, but stopping them is bad because it's a violation of their rights. People who have never owned slaves have to pay slavery reparations to people who have never been slaves. After legislating gender, if a person pretends to be a woman, you're required to pretend with them. It was cool for Joe Biden to blackmail the president of Ukraine, apparently, but it is an impeachable offense if Donald Trump inquired into it. People who have never been to college are now being pushed into paying the debts of college students who took out huge loans for their degrees. Immigrants with tuberculosis and polio are welcome, but you'd better be able to prove that your dog is vaccinated. Irish doctors and German engineers who want to immigrate to the United States must go through rigorous vetting. But any illiterate gangbanger who jumps the southern fence is welcome. $5 billion for border security is too expensive, but $1.5 trillion for free health care to illegals is not. If you cheat to get into college, you go to prison, but if you cheat to get into the country, you get to go to college for free. And pointing out all of this hypocrisy somehow makes us racist. Nothing makes sense anymore. No values, no morals, no civility. People are dying of Chinese virus, but it's racist to refer to it as Chinese, even though it came from China. We are clearly living in an upside-down world, Dave Ramsey writes, where right is wrong, wrong is right, where moral is immoral, and where good is evil and evil is good, where killing murderers is wrong, but killing innocent babies is right. And he has this admonition: wake up, America. The great unsinkable ship Titanic America has hit the iceberg. It's taken on water. Now, when you combine all of this, and some of you are perfectly comfortable with this, and that's what troubles me. Some of you are perfectly comfortable with this. Oh, yeah, it's all fine. Look what they did in the House of Representatives just a few days ago. They got rid of all gender-related words that representatives can speak. You can no longer use the words mother or father. You can no longer use the term sister or brother. You can no longer use the term man or woman. You even had a guy who ought to have known better because he's supposedly a reverend give a prayer before the beginning of a congressional session a few days back, who ended it with the word amen and a woman. Really? Come now. Amen. It's Latin. It means so be it. Has nothing whatever to do with gender, but he genderized it as though somehow or other it does. This is the craziness. This is the insanity. This is the every idea is fine, do whatever the hell you want as long as it pleases you attitude that is going to destroy this country. And this is the basic fundamental formula for the next 4 years that the American electorate supposedly approved. I don't think so. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. Americans don't say those things themselves. But the far left does, and the far left now, come January 20th, runs the country. Inescapable in all of this chaos, is the role of the American mainstream press. You can't go anywhere, do anywhere, anything, say anything, see anything, believe anything, read anything, but that you don't come into contact with the agenda of the press. There can be no question about the immense power of America's news media. There can be no denying that the news media and certain social media platforms are perhaps the largest influences in the formation of American public opinion. Think about that. Where do you get your ideas? The critical thinker always asks the question, where did that come from? A critical thinking journalist would always ask the question, where did that come from? Who gave me that information? But more than that, the critically thinking journalist would say, why did they do that? What's in it for them? They would vet the information they were about to report to you because they wanted to report the truth. They don't do that anymore. They just report it. And very often they agree with it. And even if they know that it's probably not true, they're going to report it anyway. There can also be no denying that these media outlets have pet agendas to advance. They have become advocates. They are no longer journalists in the classic definition of that word. They are advocates. They are selling something. They are not merely about publishing news and information, which reluctantly, after all the years that I have been in this industry, I have come to the opinion that if our founding fathers could have seen accurately into the future to where they could observe the corrupt press in the year 2021, they would never, ever have given the media the First Amendment protections they have so egregiously violated. They would never, ever have done that. We cannot rely on government to right the wrongs the news and information institutions have perpetrated. Government cannot do it because government will not do it. They benefit too much from it. We cannot expect politicians who have benefited so greatly from alliances with a corrupt media to agree to rein in their partners who have advanced their careers. We can't expect them to do that, especially now that those politicians who are on the left control both houses of the Congress and the White House come the 20th of January. The only avenue that is available to us is to handle this on our own. But that requires something that we thus far have not been either willing or able to demonstrate. I have told you many a time, and I know it offends some of you. You may have a 160 IQ, I may have a 160 IQ, he may have a 160 IQ, but collectively the American public has the IQ of a fire hydrant. and they have the attention span of a fish. There it is, now it's gone. They don't know where much of what they think came from. They cannot, in fact, verify a lot of the things they hear themselves saying. They rely on sources that are not reliable sources. But mostly they approach the whole process with indifference. Imagine if that was true if you were buying a car, or a loaf of bread, or a box of cereal, a quart of milk. Imagine if you were so indifferent you didn't care whether it was past the pull date or not. You just buy it. I trust the vendor. I go to this grocery store, I buy it. And what happens when you discover that the milk is in fact sour? You take it back and you get angry about the situation, and you don't trust those folks in the future. You don't buy from them anymore. Somebody sells you a lemon at a car dealership, you don't go back. But that's because you're paying attention and you realize, it's costing me a lot of money. It's costing me a lot of effort. I got to work X number of years to pay off that contract. Think about politics the same way. Think about ideology the same way. That's how we resolve this. The only avenue available to us, it seems to me, is what I would call consumerism. We have got to learn to regard news and information as we do any other commercial commodity we buy. We're buying news and information. You subscribe to that cable system, you pay for that newspaper subscription, you pay for that cell phone, that smartphone in which you get information online, your computer, your IT services. You're buying all of this. And of course, if the IT services don't work and you can't get online, and it happens, continuously or too often for your patients, you're going to go to some other source, some other vendor. When it comes to politics, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of vendors. There are only a few. And if they are all corrupt, and in many respects they are, then you really have got to be a careful consumer. That is how we're going to resolve this. Because the people who are in charge of our system have already played us for suckers a long, long time. And they're going to continue to do that as long as we're willing to be suckers. And we have been willing to do it. We truly have. For a long time we have. And it's not because we're bad people. And it's not because we have indefensible agendas to try to pursue. It's because we just don't allow ourselves to know enough about the product, i.e. news and information, to be able to make an intelligent decision about what we're willing to believe and what we're not. And as long as the media knows we're not either capable of doing that or willing to do that, then it's their advantage. Ball game theirs. Game over. But if we continue to follow this path, as Dave Ramsey says, we've struck the iceberg and we will sink. And then there will not be any survivors. Then it's over. This experiment we call the Democratic Republic of the United States of America is a fragile process. And if you're going to get angry about a few people crashing into the rotunda of the Capitol, and you should get angry about that, then you should ask yourself the question, why are these sorts of things happening in my country? They never did before. What's going on? You can blame the ideologies you don't agree with, but you cannot escape the reality that it's bigger than that. You cannot escape it. In our next program, 2 weeks from today, we're going to get into this a little bit deeper. I'm going to teach you how to be a consumer of news and information, and I hope you'll ask lots of questions in the process. I appreciate your attention today. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons. And this is For Critical Thinking. Thank you for watching.
Thanks for tuning in to this edition of For Critical Thinkers. Join Mike Fitzsimmons twice each month for a chance to share your views about important issues that affect our lives. Stay tuned to Spokane Talks for our next scheduled session.